Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you today?
Good, thanks.
Good, thanks.
Oh, good. So it's Brian Vogel here, and I'm with the executive leadership team from On Time Edge.
Dave Hinkler here. Aaron Mull.
Michael Babino.
All right. Well, look, guys, first and foremost, thank you for your time. And, we wanted to sit down as a precursor to kicking off the first annual scheduling summit in Philadelphia here in 2025, and just have a kind of wide-ranging discussion. I think we're at a really interesting inflection point where technology has really created a very unique situation for the typical scheduler or typical planner to look at their challenges differently, and also the path to value is evolving. So really what we want to kind of do is just set the stage with that as a premise, and with our collective expertise of 30-40 years of implementations across the whole spectrum of planning, scheduling, and manufacturing systems. I think that it positions us to have a really kind of deep discussion relative to our recommendations and how we should be interpreting some of the trends that are happening, and over the course of the next 3 days really impart some of that, as well as get some feedback. So with that being said, if you were to wave a magic wand and say, hey, I really think this is the most important trend within the planning and scheduling segments of manufacturing, what might you think, Michael?
So I would say, we're in 2025 now. I think technology is, I wouldn't say a given, but it's stable and working. But still, companies are not fully using technology. They're not really getting all the value still to this day that they wanted to get to when they acquired and implemented all that technology. Technology is there, but the buy-in from people is still as necessary as it always was. Mm-hmm. But technology is no longer the focus. I think when APS came on stage and supply chain planning and MES, there were some systems that were working, some of them were not working. So you had to wait until they mature and become usable and valuable. But the value, the tangible value, the financial results, the increase of on-time delivery, the reduction of inventory in the process, increase in inventory turns, and lowering costs, removing unplanned overtime, unplanned downtime, those are still there today.
It's interesting. I think that, if you look at the tenet of what are the foundational challenges, obviously people and process are always going to be a challenge relative to change and new technology. And then as new technology continues to mature, you could either chase that maturity, or you can actually look at it from a strategy perspective, and how do you kind of crawl, walk, and grow. So with that kind of premise that technology has evolved and is fairly stable, Aaron, what do you think right now is some of the challenges that are stopping some of the process change or people's readiness to want to try and dive in and get more value out of something they've already invested in, or start thinking about adjacent value?
Well, it's interesting. Everyone wants one software solution to solve all their problems, of course. So do we run our business. But it's not there yet. As much as the software vendors are improving their products, they're faster to deploy, they're easier to use, they still don't do everything that someone wants, right? The ERP vendors promise it all, but they can't deliver it. Even in the world of planning and scheduling, you want a tool that can do long horizon planning, right? 2 to 3 year, in some cases, planning, or 6 to 12 month planning. You also want short horizon, finite capacity scheduling that's not only scheduling your equipment, people want to schedule their people. There's actually a whole complete different sets of software packages out there. One schedules equipment, one schedules people. So as much as the technology is better than it was, far better, it still doesn't do everything you want. And so the hardest thing is to understand what it's really good at, and build a project plan and build expectations around that, and decide where you're going to fit in the different software vendors into an ecosystem, not just a standalone piece of software. How is it going to work with everything else?
Just wanted to add to that because it sparked something in my mind. When we asked ourselves, at least internally, what we wanted out of this summit, we wanted to communicate to people the risks of asking a system to do everything. There's a concept we're going to talk about during the summit called contorting systems, which is trying to shape a system into something it wasn't designed to do. So more on that during the summit, but these were some of the things we were talking about.
Dave, when you look at the collective skills that On-Time Edge brings, we have 650 implementations over the course of our duration. You have spent half of your life on the customer side of the equation, as well as the other half of your professional career in the product side. But when you look at some of the points being raised, and when you talk about contorting systems, that happens more than people want to take ownership of. But can you weigh in on what you believe, first and foremost, what is the biggest challenge in terms of adoption of these defined systems, and how does that relate to the demarcations of capability versus custom extension?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with Michael. I mean, setting up the stage where we do have the technology. This is not a technology thing anymore. I mean, after 35 years, and this is going to be my 100th conference that I think I've been to, I do believe we are now ready to start focusing on business processes. The business processes and the manufacturing processes has to come together. I mean, look at Jeffrey Moore was trying to cross the chasm 30 some years ago, right?
Great book.
Great book. It's a great place to start our analogy, but the technology's there. It's not going to be one system. We can't look for a system that's going to solve world hunger. It's not there, but we got to get better at data integration, and we got to get better at understanding what Michael just said. There's certain things that the core systems is supposed to be doing. That's its function and its sole purpose of providing the data and the information and the activities to these certain personas on the plant floor. And there's other things that we try to always customize. And a lot of times, and I'll be honest, and I was a vendor for years, the vendor drives these customers to use their solutions instead of saying, what is the best practice? What is the solution that we should actually be driving to? And how can we integrate another vendor's solution with this in a better manner? That's not happening.
It's certainly not. I mean, if you go back 10 years ago and, everyone came up with these great, acronyms, and one of which was IoT, and instantly it was like, oh, the Internet of Things, it's everything, it becomes instantaneously available. But we took a position, I remember a conversation you and I had in St. Louis a decade ago, and said, no, it's not really availability, it's interoperable. That is the key to the kingdom. So on that vein, I think what we've seen some of the struggles around wider AI adoption and large language models, and some of the challenges that, models as a whole for that matter, not just large, both small, is the data availability, which is absolutely contingent upon, to your point of systems integrations. Where do each of you think the landscape sits right now in terms of the maturity curve? Are folks just now becoming aware that that's the critical lifeline to establish, a foundational, a component to grow? Or do you think some people have gotten it, they just are not looking at the business case, in the right context? And I'd love to get each of your perspectives on that.
I mean, I think with the right data strategy, you can change your entire software strategy. I see so many companies, they make a software selection and they do the best they can to make the best selection. It's hard. As a manufacturer, you don't know the software market. So you have to rely on referrals and friends and reading the internet, which, right, I don't know how much that's going to help you. With the right data strategy, you could now, instead of trying to make whatever package you've picked work at all costs, and I'm gonna fix my data and I'm gonna change my processes to match the software. Instead, you could fail quickly. You could spend your time and energy on the data part, get it right, and plug in a couple solutions and run them in parallel and run them side to side. I don't see companies doing that, but with the right data strategy, it enables that, and it's such a better way. You're not gonna make the right selection all the time. It's okay.
Yeah.
Fail quickly. The best adopters of digital transformation, I believe, they know how to fail quickly and pivot to something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one thing, so along the maturity of technology lines, I recently told a customer that was asking questions about the integration. Are you going to be able to connect to our systems? Or we have a legacy system over here, we're not even sure we can connect to it. Right. I haven't seen in the last, I do remember that project around 2004 where integration was a problem and was a cause for the failure. I don't think that's there anymore. All the systems, all the database systems have a way to fairly easily connect, right? I'm sure you have your...
At what cost?
Exactly. So we've been talking about using best of breed for a long time, but today it is true. Again, if you have the data strategy and data, I wouldn't say it's a given, I wouldn't say it's simple. With who knows what AI will allow us to do in the future, right? Maybe we can, talk about two systems and it'll automatically connect them, or 90% of the work will be done. It still doesn't guarantee that you're going to produce the results, right? So companies have to spend more time than ever educating themselves on what it is that they're really after.
So the business case, defining the business case.
And the business process. I mean, it goes back to Dave's point, right? Because the way that you're working today in Excel may not be the way you should work in a system.
Yeah, let's face it, the systems approach was done 30 years ago, and then we got to data centricity, and we spent a decade on data centricity. To your point, the data's there. We need to get into the process, operations process centricity, and really understand the business processes and what we're trying to drive and solve on the manufacturing floor. And that's what hasn't been focused on, in my mind, over the last 5-10 years.
Once you get that machine connectivity and you're integrated to some of your operation systems, whether it be an MES system, a batch system, a DCS, how does that correlate to value from a scheduling or planning perspective, Aaron?
Well, the interesting thing about scheduling specifically is ultimately what you're doing when you implement a scheduling system is you're sitting down and you're modeling the process flow through the manufacturing plant, right? What are the steps or operations I'm following to transform my raw materials into my product? But you're also modeling how long it takes. And the data that's being used for cycle times, for changeover times, for setup times, for cleans in the world of pharma, a lot of times that data is coming from time studies that were done 10, 15, 20 years ago. And they've been put into the ERP system. They're used for costing purposes now. And there's not enough, in my opinion. What I've seen is there's not enough going back and checking and make sure that the time's right? That's ultimately what an MES does. An MES is a permanent time study. It's constantly checking and recording how long these things take. And so instead of getting the cycle times and the changeover times from your ERP system or from someone's Excel spreadsheet or an old dusty binder, use the system that's tracking it. And if you don't have an MES, that's okay. You can implement one pretty quickly these days and just keep it simple and marry up how long things take with your schedule, and you'll get a better schedule. Have that feedback loop, right? Make sure that people are talking to each other. One set of people are creating the forward-looking schedule, the best way to run the plant. The other ones are executing, and they need to be talking to each other, not just the systems, but the people too, and talking to each other and exchanging information.
So it's a continuous improvement loop.
Yes.
Michael, thoughts?
Yeah, these are the first times at which we can, I think, do that. Initially, when there was an MES system in place, we were asked to put in an APS system. The best we could do, or the expectation was, the bar was fairly low. Just make sure that we can display on the MES what people have to do at each workstation. Nowadays, if we can paint the picture, and the tools are there and they're easy to access and easy to use, what you're going to execute will be recorded. Why don't we track automatically the outliers, right, from the last times we ran these parts, and make the scheduling system better? Because scheduling systems are going to be used to look at short to midterm, mostly short-term capacity, true availability of capacity, and as a result, the impact on customer orders or demand that are using those orders. So there's a lot more today that can be done between an MES and an APS than even 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So funny, from 25 years experience with MES, right? We always took the orders from ERP, right? And we were always focused on how we're going to dispatch it across all the different work centers. And then we didn't question anything else, right? We didn't give them that feedback loop to make it proper. We're done. As long as I could, create the right routing or dynamic routing to make my process work, that was fine. So what you said is now it's time to connect the two.
Yeah.
And then you have to decide what to do with the disruptions, right?
Yeah.
Do you build it into the model and add enough buffering so that you're not constantly fighting fires? Or do you react when it happens? And that's the art part of all of this, right? Is in my opinion, you build in enough buffering to account for the 5-minute downtime events, or the 5 minutes where someone can't find the materials they need. And then if you have a big downtime event, you actually build the system so that you can reschedule and schedule around that.
You're going to create a schedule, and people always want, when they shop for an APS, among other things, is they want a system that will react. What people want is flexibility.
Yeah.
Well, flexibility has different definitions, and between customers, between industries, and often what they want is, I know that things will go wrong on the shop floor. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Murphy has the corner office of every manufacturing facility out there, as we all know. And when things happen, I want to be able to reschedule on a dime. Well, if something happens, a part is bad that's feeding a critical piece of equipment, and you lose an hour of capacity on your drum or on your constraint, you'll never get that hour back. So you need to plan for, as Aaron was saying, a time buffer upstream from the constraint to make sure that whatever happens, and it will happen, that you can still keep that machine, the critical machine, going. So hopefully we'll communicate that over the next few days during the summit, but it is so common and so misunderstood. People think that they want the tightest schedule as possible, and they want the ability to reschedule all the time.
Right.
Well, rescheduling in the system doesn't mean that you'll have time to put the parts back in place after you made the changes to, staging takes time, depending on the industry. We have customers, we have a wide variety of customers, and I think it's based on the internal cycle time. We have customers that receive an order in the morning and have to ship it in the afternoon. So their cycle time is really tight, their lead time is really tight. For them, mid to long term is 3 days and more.
Yeah.
And then you have, on the other end of that spectrum, people making truck bodies where it takes a few days to make a truck body. So for them, short term is a week, maybe even a month, and long term is 2 to 4 months. But there is a line that needs to be drawn between what short term is and mid to long term is. So we'll try to communicate that as clearly in several of our sessions to make sure that people come away with a clear understanding of how to fairly measure the people that are using those systems, and how to fairly measure the systems themselves. That makes sense.
This week, I was at a cereal manufacturer in the Midwest, and one of the issues that they're challenged with is integration to packaging and shipping. And and what I'd like to understand from both of your perspective, Michael and Aaron, is if I'm going to readjust based on some corrective action, and now all of a sudden I have multiple fulfillment orders, coming out that may impact my shipping or my chargeback fees or my deduction fees at my end retailer. What are some of the things I should start thinking about, or some of the integration points? Is it back to some type of ERP integration? Is there other considerations that we think is worthy of discussion?
Depends on your infrastructure. It's interesting. A lot of the companies that were ahead of their competitors from a digital perspective 20, 30 years ago, they've built up so much technical debt, and they have so many, point-to-point integrations that for them, the answer might be different than for someone who's actually was behind or is behind today. They can actually leapfrog their competition. And ultimately, instead of sending the data directly to a system, I think the better answer is to send it to a message bus so it can be shared with multiple systems. So instead of one integration to each system, you have one and only one to the message bus. It's a simpler architecture, it's faster, it's way less expensive, but it is interesting when you sit down and you look and you say, okay, my ecosystem has 20 systems, say, and I want to get data between system A and system B. It's less expensive to build a point-to-point integration than a message bus when you only have 2 systems. And that's the fallacy, because so many companies make the decision based on that one use case. But in the long run, if you share the data from system A with the message bus and then with system B, that's more expensive But the minute that you have to share it with system C or D or E or F, it's radically less expensive. And so there needs to be more time spent looking at the broader architecture and not just the, having my blinders on and looking at just my problem that I'm trying to solve today.
Yeah. I think the acceptance from people that are in charge of maintaining those systems would go up significantly, because when a company wants to implement a system, different groups of people within the organization have different perceptions and different reactions. From the IT side of things, they'd like to keep it simple, but they think that a point-to-point integration is the way to keep it simple, without seeing further down the line, and the flexibility that you mentioned before, which is we can easily unplug one system, put the best one. There's going to be another best system that we may choose in 2 or 3 years from now. And recreating all the connections to the existing systems will take a lot of time. If we already have the message bus, then it's just not quite plug and play, but close to it. And I think if IT looks at implementing systems and using best of breed systems, different types of systems, even within one type, having one or two, doing benchmarks between two different systems, then the architecture for the data makes it so much easier. But the decision needs to be made strategically by the company to, instead of doing point-to-point integrations, we have a data strategy, right?
Dave, first and foremost, you've been involved in security of the OT environment for many, many years. From the perspective of impact of point-to-point solutions versus a message bus, and the second part of that question, before you answer, is on a message bus, is it better to have a two-tiered IT OT, with some type of DMZ, so that you have much better, kind of load balancing and persona-driven access? So it's really two parts to that I'd like you to answer.
Yeah, from an OT security perspective, digital transformation is creating all kind of havoc, because we're integrating IT systems with OT systems, operation technology systems. Anything affecting the manufacturing process itself is considered an OT system. And right now we're having the security aspects of protecting in what people in the security industry say. So do we put all of our eggs in one basket, or do we spread it across all these point-to-point solutions? And a lot of good security people would like to have it in one, enterprise service bus, so that I can actually monitor it and trend it, and I can have knowledge graphs to track every transaction and how it goes throughout the infrastructure. So, my personal opinion is develop a strong enterprise service bus, a manufacturing service bus, a strong corporate service bus, have that DMZ in the middle, so that you can make sure that those proxies going back and forth between that data are protected, and then focus on the outside systems. The biggest threat, right, and it's still history of OT security, is 60% of OT security issues are happening from the personas inside the plant. And it's not because they're trying to do bad things, it's because they don't know what to do. So they expose it to outside different connections and integrations, and that causes problems. So we got to get better at, let's put our eggs in the one basket, know where all our threat vectors are, and then protect those threat vectors. And for OT security, it's 62443, standard out in the industry. So.
Earlier about persona-driven data availability. So you think about that in ground. You might have quality, you might have reliability, you might have engineering, maintenance, sustainability, planning, scheduling at the plant level, and then you have enterprise above that. And what I'd like to do is kind of pivot right now to talk a little bit more about the implications about frontline enablement, some of the IP that is eventually leaving because of the great retirement that we're seeing with the baby boomers. But at the same time, you touched on something about unintended outcomes. So if you really want to drive value from a digital strategy perspective, persona-driven interaction, who needs data when they need it, at the time they need it, in the context they need it. That is really like the holy grail of what people are moving towards. But with that, kind of like Spider-Man, with great responsibility comes, whatever great, keep me honest.
But with great power comes great responsibility.
There you go. So there also inherently means risk. So, first is, from your collective perspective, is there a way to operationalize the current tool sets within the confines of their capabilities that can both help retain some of the intellectual property with the folks that are, know it, and second, create an environment of learning that as the new generation comes in, there is tools readily available to make that transition smoother?
Everybody talks about data, very few people talk about, and I think data and information are being discussed as the same thing. To me, they're very different, right? A wise man said, Goldratt in the Haystack Syndrome quoted, "Information is the answer to the question asked. Therefore, data isn't information." What I mean by that is if you can distill down any process by a set of questions that you need the answer to. And whether you can ask someone or you have to ask a system, it's still the answer to the question asked. So information is the answer to that question asked. If you ask the wrong questions to the system, and we see it all the time, right? There can be a proliferation of reports that are useless and don't get used. If you distill the process down to the answers that you can get from a system, you simplify a whole lot of your implementation and whatever continuous improvement you're doing with the system. Does that make sense? I know we talked about it before, but
it does, absolutely. And I think I'm going to add one thing back to my earlier 2 points, and I'd like you to address, both of you actually address this. As a vendor, with the collective expertise that we bring and our ability to, deliver ongoing support, what role do you see managed services in both bridging the gap of this transition of knowledge, but more importantly, keeping true to the pillars upon which you built your ROI and expanding on it?
Well, I'm going to go back to what Dave said earlier. I think, especially with the aging workforce, business process, right? I mean, as new technologies and new systems get introduced, in order to take an order from a customer and produce the product and ship the product, that process spans multiple systems. And there's so much tribal knowledge in the workforce that's been there for 30 years that they know, yeah, sure, on paper, there's five lines that can run this product, but I know line 3 always performs best. And so I'm going to schedule it on line 3. And so a managed services team, to me, needs to bridge the gap between what are the systems capable of and what's the best way to use them to bring value to the company, to our customer, right? And so our customers know so much about the companies that we'll never know because of their experience. We know what the systems are capable of, and just as importantly, what they're not capable of, right? That gets lost a lot, right? Yeah. Don't try to force it to do something that it can't do. So we have to marry up what are they trying to accomplish, what will truly bring value to the company, what will truly bring value to the individual, and then how do we systematize that? And I think we have to understand not just what the system's doing, but what the whole business process does that starts in the ERP.
There's an interdependency of both tribal knowledge, i.e. the culture and the capabilities. There is the equipment, machinery side, and then there's the actual just business process. And what are those intersections? So you think from a managed services perspective, those that can connect the dots there are going to be best suited to help customers drive their outcome and value and sustain it.
I wish every software system could give you statistics on how many times people are extracting data out, right? Because typically they have a good reason. Mm-hmm. They're taking the data out usually into Excel, right? Yeah. And they're manipulating it, and maybe they're loading it back into that system, or maybe they're transferring it somewhere else to some other system, right? And that not only is that a security issue, but that's a business process issue, right? There may be an integration already designed to do what they're doing, and maybe they don't know that it's there. Possible. Maybe it's a training issue. Maybe they just don't know how to best use it. But you have to track that, and you have to know what's going on in order to improve it.
Yeah. There's the concept of technology debt, technical debt, which we talk about internally quite a bit. It simply means that people can be overusing a system or asking questions to the system and getting answers that are not actionable. They're just for gut feel verification, or because there's the perception that we need to have that information available in case somebody asks. Well, in order for us to replace people that are retiring, it needs to be as simple as possible. I do believe that if it's done well, which we can help with our managed services, if it's done well, we can, I don't mean this to treat people as objects, but someone can retire, you can bring somebody else and connect that person to the processes that person was actually executing. If it's done well.
Yes.
Without waiting years and years for the tribal knowledge, for that person to acquire the tribal knowledge that just left out the door, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. You know, you talked about security, and in the security world, we basically say if you can't see it, if it's not visible, you cannot protect it, right? Because you don't know, it's a black box. But the same thing with process, right? And getting people to interact together. When you think of IT, you think of transactional-based data operations and actions. When you think of manufacturing operations, you think event-driven, more real-time than their different time frames. We need to have visibility, better process mining of those processes at the IT layer and the processes at the manufacturing layer, and bring them together so they know how things are interacting if they do make a change in a product, a new product introduction comes along. If they do make a change within the maintenance in order, because now we have an unplanned downtime that we have to go in that production schedule agility that you talked about, revamped our resources. And if we have visibility, and with enabling technologies, AI and digital twins and digital threads, I know we can get this visibility so that it's more like it's proactive and it's responsive based, not reactive, waiting after the fact and then doing the analysis of the data. That's got to go away.
So we're at an interesting time, almost at its own inflection point in where manufacturers and how they're growing. You know, it tends to be cyclical, like every decade or so. Top 5 pharma buy the next 15, and some of the consumer manufacturers partner. How disruptive is new plant acquisitions coming into a portfolio versus adding a plant that's already within the portfolio?
From a system standpoint? Yeah, that's a good question.
Great question.
Let's
That's a great
put a box
question.
around it for planning and scheduling.
Who wants to start with this?
I don't want to say any names or any companies, but it happens. It happens all the time, right? And companies, large companies, want to acquire where they see a need in the market, and they want to quickly adapt to it. It hasn't gone right, for the last 20, 30 years that I've been in corporate America, right? Because I think we don't really focus on the business processes that we're trying to adapt into our organization, and focusing on the right kind of goals and metrics that we're trying to drive to. And it's not shared between each other.
So can I interject one additional comment for you guys to think about? So absent the breakdown of history, if you look at, say, a TSA and the impact of its financial implications versus saying a well-structured reference architecture that allows for adoption, back to the point that we were talking about, depends on the system, depends on, the product line, what's that intersection? What is a recommended, if you were to go to one of the largest, consumer manufacturers and say, hey, half your strategy is to purchase new and a third of your strategy is to shift capacity, what would be the right starting place to kind of come back? And maybe that's a better way of looking at it, because these are growth levers that companies are looking at. And more often than not, history will suggest that if a plant doesn't have a core operating system like an MES or a planning or scheduling, there's usually a financial reason why. It just, whatever right, wrong, or indifferent, it wasn't high enough of a value or return to do.
Too small.
Right.
But so the first question is, summing up the 3 different questions that I asked, if you are a manufacturer and you have a growth trajectory tied to acquisition, what would be our recommendation from a planning and scheduling? And then 2, how do we help them think about a consideration of architecture to the earlier points that allow them to go back to those plants that perhaps didn't have the high dollar volume to justify the initial investment, but by virtue of scale and lowering the paths of adoption can help them achieve, value in and of themselves.
Well, I mean, there's cost that plays into it. So if I'm making the same product in an older plant with older equipment versus if I'm starting a greenfield plant and I'm buying new equipment, typically there's going to be process improvements in the equipment.
Automation.
But that also manifests itself into it's less expensive to go implement a scheduling system, right? An older plant may have 50 machines and I have to schedule all 50 machines, whereas a newer plant has 5 lines. Those machines are all tied together already. The material movement's all done. And so I'm only modeling same products, same volumes, 5 lines versus 50 machines, right? And so there's more modeling that needs to be done in the scheduling system. There's more opportunity for disruption. There's more buffers that have to be built in. You're probably gonna have more people operating that plant. It's more expensive. And so the equipment that you pick plays a big part of that. But on the flip side of that, you're buying equipment, you haven't run it before. You don't know, is it really gonna perform to the specs that you're promised by the OEM? So, I mean, that's what everyone has to kind of to look at and juggle when they're looking at buy versus build, I think, from a company perspective.
So I think that, obviously when a manufacturer is buying another plant, rarely is it because of capacity, it's always because of product line.
Right.
And if there's a greenfield plant going up, there's usually at the cost of consolidation. So there's other financial, kind of frameworks that are in the play there. But in the context of what we're seeing, where these plants aren't going to be built new, they're going to be rolled in. Yeah. And now all of a sudden there may be a secondary discussion where instead of keeping the new plant on a TSA, can we shift that capacity to one of our existing plants? So from that perspective, from an adoption curve specific to planning and scheduling, what are some of the things that manufacturers should consider up front, or what best practices would we recommend to help them fundamentally understand a proper adoption curve?
Know your bottleneck. When you walk into a plant and you ask them, where's your bottleneck? Do you know where it is? Sometimes people will say, oh yeah, I know where it is, it's over there. But another common answer is, well, it changes. It moves around, right? It depends what products we're running, depends what day of the week it is. And they're right. Who am I to argue with them? Of course, they know their plant, but if their bottleneck moves, their plant is less efficient than the plant where the bottleneck doesn't move. That's the first part. If you can pull it off, if you can run your plant in such a way that your bottleneck doesn't move, that makes the job of planning for long-term capacity planning, long-term material planning, long-term supply planning, that makes that job so much easier. And if you can keep your bottleneck from moving from a scheduling and execution perspective, you've made your life so much better. Already, it's a nicer place to work. You're gonna have less firefighting. It doesn't mean it's easy to accomplish, but if you can accomplish it, everything gets easier, everything gets better, not just the systems, but the people.
Absolutely, and everybody that hears this will probably ask themselves that question, well, how do I determine what it is? Well, falling victim to a bottleneck because of a given product mix or a market we decided to go after is one thing. Deciding strategically to decide where the bottlenecks are going to be, where the constraints are going to be, is the way to go. And the decision's always made along the lines of, what is the equipment, what is the process that is critical to us? If we do it better than our competition, we will win the game. And typically also, what is the equipment or the process that's the most expensive to elevate?
Yeah.
So cereal plant, I think I've been to one of their divisions. You were talking about, Brian, as well. They have extrusion and packaging, relatively simple operation. And buying a second extruder, or the production side of making the cereal as opposed to packaging it, the cost is in the 50 to 100 million range, right? It's addition to the plant as well, physically to the building. And that particular plant where we were at, the director of operations followed his gut, and he was right by saying, hey, I'm going to give myself all the flexibility I need in packaging. because packaging lines are relatively inexpensive. Training people to run them is relatively easy compared to this big process. So for them, no brainer, our extrusion or fabrication, or it could be assembly or packaging, you decide what is critical for you and what's the most expensive piece of your business to elevate, meaning to double capacity on.
Brian, I'm dying to ask our planning and scheduling experts a question. Having gone through a couple mergers and acquisitions and plant consolidations and shutdowns in the recent 2 to 3 years, I do have a question. Same question, but it's a little different. So these activities takes months and months in advance from corporate executives to make these decisions. Do you guys believe, from a planning and a scheduling perspective, that there was enough time to really look at the right data, look at the right information, talk about the right planning issues and the right scheduling issues to determine whether we should be merger and acquisition or shutting down? I mean, I think it's
I think it's often too much of a financial decision and not enough practical planning and scheduling. There is a trend, to answer your question, Brian, there is a trend that at the corporate level, planning needs to be done, has to be done. And it's not made with the same information because you're not asking the same questions as individual plants, right? Mm-hmm. So there is clearly a trend in the market in terms of architecture of types of systems where corporate will have planning functions, often done in an ERP system, often done with lacking features and functionality and information to make the decisions. And at the plant level is where the rubber hits the road. That's where the detailed scheduling is done. Sometimes you'll see planning done at the plant as well. But strategic decisions such as, can we redeploy, before we build a new plant or acquire a company to acquire their capacity or product lines, can we disperse our products differently within the supply chain to still satisfy demand with no investment? That decision cannot be made without a planning system or some way to model capacity and the right discussions with the right information between executives that are making those decisions. It's often made at the financial level and financial mainly. And there should be more consideration of planning, capacity of planning, labor availability, labor qualification, and so on.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, a few years back, I was involved with a private equity event with a specialty chem company, and almost uniformly, everything that they had estimated relative to capacity, capability, and availability was just wrong. They were using ERP data for what the on paper capacity, as opposed to the history of production cycles that suggest that it was off by 30%. Whether it's because changeover, whatever low OEE, whatever the common denominators or underlying factors were. But that had a massive recalculation to the rate of returns. So Dave, to answer your question, I think that fundamentally it's too much of an exercise of spreadsheet based on old facts as opposed to something you said earlier, real-time views into production data that yet has a different persona. Instead of it being operational floor availability, it's a historical, holistic view of true throughput, output, capacity gaps that should be the underlying factors.
There's too much of a disconnect between the business folks in companies and the manufacturing folks. We actually implemented a scheduling system for a company that had 4 schedulers creating a schedule for the plant. 4 people. This was not a large enough plant to have 4 people. And when we created the first schedule with the APS and we took it to the shop floor, we said, hey, what do you think of this schedule? Does this look pretty good? And I said, oh yeah, that's pretty good. Would you use this? Would you follow this? Yeah, we think we'd follow that. Well, it turns out they had not been following the schedule those 4 schedulers had been producing for them for probably over 10 years. So think about the cost that this company had.
Even without the APS, before. At the start.
The schedule that the people before,
so the real scheduling was happening somewhere else.
There were 4 people creating a schedule, and the operations folks were taking a look at it, wadding it up, throwing it in the garbage, and creating their own schedule on the shop floor. And that had been going on for 10 years, and no one had noticed. Well, if they had an MES and they were tracking execution, they would have noticed.
They've seen the deviations, or they could just see.
So this is what happens. Monday morning hits, right? We have a delay on a shipment of raw materials.
What?
It hits production
Never
schedule.
happens.
We have unplanned downtime because a piece of equipment goes down, and we're scrambling left and right, and we're looking for ways to figure out how we can get this machinery to produce the schedule within the time frame that we said, right? And we don't have the data, and we don't constantly go back and forth to planning or scheduling people, because we're there and it's like Tuesday hits and you have to go with that next production schedule, and a lot of times it's on Excel or it's in someone's mind.
But this is where proper buffering comes in, right?
Absolutely.
You don't schedule a job for the same day the material's going to arrive, of course, right?
Perfect.
You can't solve every unplanned downtime event, but you can at least statistically analyze it and know how often they happen. Like some of the brewing industry in general, it's interesting. You look at the big brewers and they've got it down to a science. They're filling and bottling lines. They know exactly how much downtime they're going to have on the labeler because they've been tracking it for so long, and they build buffering into the conveyor to make sure the filler never stops.
Mm-hmm.
You go to the microbreweries who make great beer, and I like their product, but they haven't figured this out yet.
Right.
And the information's available. They're not bothering to look. And so what they're doing is they're tying their labeler directly to their filler. And anytime the labeler goes down, the filler goes down, right? And just these simple concepts, buffering built into the actual layout of the equipment is one thing. Buffering built into the planning and scheduling also. And people do it. I mean, that's why some companies have massive inventories. It's a buffer. Basically what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to make sure we always have enough inventory to run, but at what cost? Yeah. Can they balance that? Yeah. Can they reduce that buffer? So maybe they only need a week buffer instead of a month buffer, 2 month buffer.
The easiest example we use all the time with manufacturing companies because buffers, time buffers, so make sure you plan to finish something a little bit ahead of when you're going to use it downstream is perceived as waste. So that's bad, right?
It also ties up a lot of capital as well.
It does. So here's the example. You start work at 8 a.m., okay? You live 10 minutes away from the plant. And if you don't get to your job on time at 8 o'clock, you're not going to be paid for that day. What time do you leave home? You're 10 minutes away from the plant.
7:40. 10-minute buffer.
With a 10-minute buffer, some people would say 7. It depends on how bad you need your salary. It depends on how close you are, how much variability there is in that 10-minute drive. Variability is the reason why we recommend to include time buffers. It's simple. We do it on our daily lives every day. But when all of a sudden, when you transfer that to the shop floor, there's a bell curve of the standards in the middle that's always followed by every piece of equipment with every part out there. It normally takes 30 minutes, but some days it takes 27, some days it takes 33. Yeah. You can work, try to eliminate variability, and Six Sigma has been trying to do that for years and years, until you literally drive yourself out of business. And you can find case studies on that of companies that did that. They tried to eliminate all the variability in their process. There is a simple way to produce consistently on time despite the presence of variability, and it's called managing with time buffers. So that's the value add that our managed services can bring to our customers, certainly for brand new implementations. That concept is intuitive, very simple, but yet very powerful. It can be the difference between a failed APS implementation where you're trying to constantly adjust and reschedule on the fly and creating chaos and losing trust on the shop floor, because they can't move those parts quickly enough, right?
Right.
And a huge success with a stable schedule. This is the value I think that OnTime Edge brings to our customers, which is, of course we can do what you're recommending, but let me tell you the stories of what happened when you run too tight on your schedule. So you plan to finish at 2 p.m. the first operation, you're planning to start the second operation at 2:15. That's not enough time, right? So what will happen? That machine will be down waiting for that part when it takes more than 15 minutes to carry it, and so on.
So you touched on a couple of really consistent themes that kind of were carried throughout
We talked about, data, we talked about integration, we talked about having systems do what they're designed to do. We talked about persona-driven use, but some of the points that you raised about, the 4 years or 10 years that the company was not following, that's a whole change management. It's not just a change management because there's lack of sight to the value you get with this new process or technology, but it's also a change management protocol where you're just not keeping people honest, on a continuous enough basis to get those baselines. So I think that, having seen your collective projects and how they interact, and I know how strategic change management is, and it's identified as a risk profile, and Dave, your team as well. I want to take a couple minutes to talk about some best practices from a change management adoption curve.
Here's an interesting thing I've noticed over the years. Sometimes it helps just to be the new person, right? When someone's worked at a company long enough, they may have put their hand up and said, I have a really good idea, we should do this once, maybe twice, but usually they're not going to do it if, they're not going to do it over and over and over again if they're not being listened to, right? Mm-hmm. And so having a fresh face come in and ask the same question that was asked 10 years ago, sometimes that it might get that answer.
And maybe different questions.
Yeah, or different questions too. So, that's part of it, right? You get those good ideas to resurface, and then you actually have to take action against them, or else they're going to stop giving you good ideas, right? But the other part is the plant's changed, the people have changed, maybe the equipment have changed. So, if we're talking about knowing your bottleneck and designing the plant around your bottleneck, you have to constantly measure. You have to constantly look and see that things haven't changed, right? Maybe I got a new packaging vendor, and that material that's the information that I used before is not the same. That label doesn't stick as well as the other one did. So I actually have more downtime. You have to be constantly reevaluating, constantly looking in order to be well run.
That's a great point. I think, Dave, I've heard you say this on more than one occasion, and I don't think you came up with it, but you've the one that enlightened me. You can't change or improve what you don't measure.
Yes.
Yeah, with leadership and how rapidly they change from their positions every 2 to 3 years, an executive leaves their position. Those shared goals and strategies and visions need to be very clear to the operators on the plant floor and the operators on the IT doing the planning side of it as well. And they have to make sure that they understand that change is inevitable, and it first starts with a mind shift in the culture. We always talk about data-driven decisions, right? That's one mind shift that we worked on for decades. But when we're switching processes and there's all that change in equipment and what we're doing and our customers, our clients, our suppliers, that all change management need to be orchestrated. And it's got to start with a shared set of common KPIs and common goals and objectives. One of the things that always happens between IT and operations technology, OT, is that we do have different time frames, right? So when we communicate what our KPIs should be, we have to translate those time sheets, because I'm on an operation execution floor standpoint, right? I operate in weeks, hours, minutes, and seconds. You're on the planning side. You do, years, months, quarters, right? And we need to translate our data and translate our KPIs into if we want to communicate, we have to have a common language into their perspectives. And then not just time frame I'm talking about, but everything. Time frame, the quality that the data, the types of summaries and calculations that they might do. And if we get better at that and more streamlined at translating that data back and forth, I think we'll have that connection better.
That's a great point. And I think if I were to close out any one thing, I would ask one more question in terms of how incumbent is upon us as a vendor to bring that level of insight to risk mitigation and best practices to project delivery, at both the upfront planning of acquiring and implementing, but ultimately on an ongoing basis. And is this something that is incorporated into the collective managed services, delivery mechanisms?
I think the most important thing that we can do is bring stories from other manufacturers on what's working and what's not working, right? We don't work in the plant every day. We don't work in that company every day. We don't know better than our customers, but what we do know is we know what the other customer's doing, right? And that's so important.
So that collegial insight, lessons learned.
Right, a summit and a conference is a good chance to get together and meet some of your peers and share ideas and stories, but a team that's working with you on a weekly basis, who's also working with and other companies on a weekly basis. That's where you really get best practices and you get knowledge sharing. It's not that someone's smarter or better. It's experience. Ultimately, it comes down to experience. And in our jobs, we're lucky. We get to see a lot of different plants and how they're run and how they're organized and how they're not organized in some cases. And those stories are so important to helping someone get better.
So, Michael, we talked a lot interchangeably about APS, Advanced Planning and Scheduling. Most companies have their own delineation of what that means. What is scheduling? What is planning? What is APS? So from your unique perspective, can you take a minute and just kind of walk us through what you believe the demarcations are between planning and scheduling? And at the same time, is it still a good practice to call it APS?
That's a very good question. In fact, internally, and hopefully this will be spread and adopted, APS as an acronym, Advanced Planning and Scheduling, was cornered a long time ago by mostly industry analysts, right? And is still being in use today. And it should really be called, nowadays, Advanced Production Scheduling. Because the planning aspect, there's clarity in the market that planning and scheduling are two business functions, two different sets of people, different personas. Some functions are done at the corporate level, some is done at the plant level. Detailed scheduling certainly is done at the plant level. So I think the lack of clarity of the delineation has caused problems with customers that we have seen. So there are things that are clearly in the planning domain, right? Sales and operations, sales inventory planning, S&OP, capital acquisition for equipment, that's long term. What are we going to sell next year? What are we planning to introduce to the market? Are we going to keep the old products or still keep them, keep producing them? Are we going to produce spares for parts that we produced 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, some of our customers, right? So some of these, again, I'll go back to the answer to the question asked. Why is this a separate process? Because the answer you need to your question is completely different. And it's based on information that's provided typically by supply chain planning systems or rough cut capacity that's part of an ERP or a planning system, right? So the answer to the question asked, what are we going to make next year? Capital acquisition, what equipment do I need to buy? Do I need to hire a bunch of employees? Do I cross-train? Do I have to let some people go? Redeploy them, etc. And there are clearly business processes that are in the scheduling domain, such as, what am I running on this equipment this morning? What do I do now that this machine is down, right? Can I try an alternate process? Is that process validated, right? Especially in life sciences. So there are clearly processes. Nobody would argue that they're part of planning and they're part of scheduling. However, there are processes that are kind of in the middle of that. Buying parts, right? Purchasing function. There's a strategic purchasing function, which is, how much will I need per month by vendor? That's mid to long term. And there's oh darn, I'm missing this component this morning. Let's call this vendor. Which vendor can provide it to me and expedite it to me, right? So there's tactical purchasing, has a strategic portion of it, vendor selection or vendor certification, that's certainly strategic, it's more planning. And there's a tactical, which is detailed scheduling. Do I have all the parts I need to work on all my orders for the next 2 days? Which parts am I missing? Do I have everything on hand? So sometimes we'll even recommend to customers that they use their APS, their Advanced Production Scheduling System, and only rely on the parts that we have on hand. Don't rely, are you maintaining your PO dates? Don't rely on things that are supposed to arrive today that you're going to start tomorrow morning. So that world is scheduling. The problem is some of our customers think that they have an APS, Advanced Planning and Scheduling. That's how it was presented to executives. It has the word planning in it. Therefore, all these planning functions We have a system to do that, right? Well, maybe we do, maybe we don't. And the market, so vendors or APS companies in general, right, that are creating those systems and maintaining them and selling them actively, have their own perception of what planning is and what scheduling is. So some of them have included planning functions as part of their scheduling package, and vice versa. So there are general trends, but there's no one specific answer. It depends on the system you're using, and again, it depends on the question, the answer that you need, and therefore, what question are you asking? That should be the guiding principle to decide this is a planning, and it should be answered by a planning system, or do we need a planning system versus do we need a scheduling system? It gets a little more complicated, but there's definitely a gray zone where you need some judgment. You may need some of our help to guide you on making the right decision. We have this problem that we need resolved, right? Should it be done in the planning system? Should it be done in the scheduling system? Or does the ERP have the capability to answer that question?
Okay.
The language is a problem. That's where everyone gets off track, in my opinion. And I think the easiest way to look at it is you have to know what materials do I need, what equipment do I need, what people do I need to make my product, right? Ultimately, that's what I'm doing. The long horizon is the planning part. There's a whole set of vendors out there that have focused on that aspect. So long horizon means different things in different industries, right? In some industries, long horizon is a couple of years, and you're breaking those years down to months and weeks, typically, and that's the way you're looking at it. In some industries, 6 months is a long horizon, and you're still breaking it down into weeks, and you're planning, you're doing your material planning, you're doing your supply planning, you're doing your inventory planning, and you're doing capacity planning. And then scheduling is short horizon. So what does that mean? That means, what am I making today? What am I making tomorrow? Maybe what am I making this week? What am I making next week? Typically, that's what you really care about from a scheduling perspective. You're still looking at capacity, but you're looking at capacity in the planning world. You're looking at a capacity from approximately how much can I make. So I'm gonna group a bunch of orders together. Here's the orders that I want the plant to run this week. Here's the group of orders I want the plant to run this month. From a scheduling perspective, you're looking at those orders and you're going, which machine am I going to run it on? I have 5 that are capable of it. Am I going to do it first shift where I got my best people? Am I going to run it second shift where I have my next set of people? Those are the decisions you're making from a short-term scheduling perspective. And if you go and look at the job title, typically for a scheduling system, it's called a production planner. So even the job title confuses the entire market.
That's true.
Right? And so
absolutely.
I think you've got to look at the easiest way to break it down, whatever language your company uses, is look at the long horizon, the long time,
So it's time.
and the short time, and simplify it from there, and then decide on the right language to use.
Sometimes it's just a matter of changing terminology, and every plant or company has their own terminology. You could call it strategic planning, right? But that has a different meaning in different industries.